my contribution today, I think, relates greatly to the discussion we had yesterday between Thomas Feist and Oliver Bakewell. And what I'll try to do is to ground that discussion more in the empirical data from the Themis project. I greatly want to applaud Eva also for relating so much to the work that has come out of the Themis project. But I'll also give you an insight of the kind of data we've collected by bringing in a lot of the quotes, a lot of the discussions that we've had. And this is mainly based on the data that I've been responsible for, so the Norwegian context. What I'm presenting now is based on a larger paper, and some of that paper I've decided to cut out. We'll have a discussion tomorrow in a panel on class. So the marriage migration that is discussed in the paper on Brazilians to Norway, we will discuss tomorrow, in case you're interested. So let me make sure that I can see what I have typed. So basically my presentation starts from the question of the usefulness of migration systems, or the migration systems perspective, and I come from that from the view of what I call a peripheral destination. And of course I'm playing a little bit here, but Norway as a peripheral destination for the three groups that we're actually studying: Brazilians, Moroccans, and Ukrainians. And also likewise, as I'll talk about later, they are quite peripheral in the Norwegian migration context. So then how useful is this migration systems perspective? And I think my conclusion, and what I will try to argue here, is that migration system thinking, with its focus on pioneers, on feedback, on thresholds, only actually explains and only is useful for certain migration flows. While moving our attention, I think that's what where I will argue I have some criticism, it actually removes our attention from some other very important types of analysis. What I'll try to do is bring back, and it relates a little bit to Thomas's point, I'll try to bring back power and politics into this. And the data I'll base this on, it's just a tiny part of the massive data collection that we've done. It's based on the Norwegian qualitative part. So it's almost 90 interviews in Norway with migrants from the three countries, and then 30 interviews in the countries of origin with either returnees or family members in Norway. So when I say that migration systems theory is useful in explaining certain types of flows, what I actually refer to is that there are great differences. There are great differences between migrants' levels of access. And in the case of Norway, having easy access can, for example, have a lot to do with the connections that people have with Norwegian individuals, Norwegian companies, and those who do not have that kind of access. And I wanted to distinguish in a very crude way between what I call wanted and unwanted migrants. We touched upon that yesterday as well. So the migration, the legal system in Europe has the kind of challenge of distinguishing between those we want to facilitate the movement of and those we want to prevent the movement of, if we want to put it that crudely. So there's wanted and unwanted migrants. A wanted migrant could be a Brazilian engineer working for a Norwegian company in Brazil and then moving to Norway in the course of that, in the course of the job, profession. And with that kind of group, what we found is that it was extremely difficult to ask many of the questions that we're asking for the Themis project about pioneers, about feedback, because it's actually a very largely, to a very large extent, it's a highly individual type of migration disconnected from the migration of co-nationals. And I'll argue that, and I'll use the data to indicate that. People move because they have the opportunity and they face limited restrictions. They're very often also encouraged to move, so they don't necessarily need assistance of co-nationals in that process. And they're also parts of networks of others with great freedom to choose whether they want to stay or whether they want to move. And they're rarely interested, to be honest, in moving to Norway. A lot of people are like, well, why would my family want to move? And why would they want to move to Norway when they're comfortable in Brazil? I think one of the things that it would be interesting to explore more there is this kind of counter movement. So, like I mentioned, the Brazilian engineer, what is actually interesting to look at is the movement of Norwegians to Brazil and how that has actually impacted the movement then from Brazil to Norway. On the other side, we have the category of unwanted or identified as unwanted migrants. And there, it's much more a collective and interwoven type of migration that really starts from a wish to move away from Morocco, to move away from Ukraine, rather than a wish to move to Norway. And there's much greater restrictions faced and also a need to have assistance from connationals. And also these migrants are often then part of networks of people who also have that wish, and they often have incentives to assist them. There I want to point out the work of Mike Collier. Very interestingly, what he does is he looks at the impact and the increasing importance of European migration policies and how that actually impacts the incentive to assist. So what he argues in work on Algerians in the UK is that because there's an increasingly restrictive regime, it's become more difficult to help people. And there's an increasing burden on those who are already in the UK, and that leads to a closing off of these assistance networks. So there, I think that is a very interesting process to look at when you look at the systemic categories. So before I explain this in greater detail with my empirical data, I think it's important to give you a little bit of an insight of why I talk about Norway as periphery. Like I said, it's a very marginal destination for the three groups, and the three groups are marginal immigrant groups in Norway. I think Oliver yesterday convincingly argued that numbers are not determining when we want to look at migration systems, but at the same time we are talking about groups of, in Norway, the whole of Norway, between 2,000 and 5,500, 6,000 people. So all these three groups are in that range. And I think the Moroccan, which is the largest group, we would call maybe a middle-size group in Norway. But that does then suggest that there's limited consequences of earlier migration patterns. Some of the groups came in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and still they're really, really small populations. So then it's an interesting case for analyzing both the value of, but also the challenges with the migration systems. Thinking. Main waves, we have two people in the audience, Gette Workman and Jean-Paul Brekke, who've, I think, written a lot more about this, and I'm basing it a lot also in the paper on Gette's work. But there are different waves that are clear in Norway, with the labor migration actually starting quite late. So the surplus net migration in Norway is not starting until 1971, and before there's a large emigration of Norwegians, mainly to the US. So this shifts with these fast oil findings, and then labor migration starts, but it's never an active recruiting policy. It's an open policy, but it's not active recruiting, and numbers have been really low. Then there's family reunification with these labor migrants from the 1980s, increasing restrictions also becoming part of Schengen. From 1980s onwards, asylum seekers as large groups, and again also family reunification there. And then I think we should also add, from the 2000s, an increasing diversification of groups, with also this new influx of skilled workers and professionals. So if you look at the present day situation in Norway, there is a rapid growth, a rapid migration growth in recent years. But currently we still talk about 8.8% immigrants, largely European. And then large non-European groups, a number of refugee populations, and the Pakistani, with all of them around 30,000. So I think with that, I can safely say that for Brazilians, Moroccans, Ukrainians, it's actually quite a marginal destination. then the present day situation, what I find interesting is that there are interesting peculiarities, I think, about the Norwegian context in terms of the skilled, unskilled migrants, where the unskilled manual jobs in Norway are actually relatively, if you look at a European context, they're relatively limited. They're in construction, caretaking, restaurant, agriculture. But the labor union in Norway has played a very central role and has really argued for same salaries, same rights, which has impacted this. And there's a smaller, again, relatively smaller informal sector than in some other European contexts. Also with a difficult survival, with a high living standards in Norway. And at the same time, there are good opportunities for high-skilled migrants. So to quote from two people, both returnees in Morocco, interviewed in Morocco from Norway, Sami Mohammed, for example, says, once it was really freezing and windy. I was so depressed. I had no job, no future, no shelter. At that particular moment, I decided to return to my family, where at least I was protected from hunger, cold, and homelessness. I'm not really satisfied with my return because I failed, but it's better than suffering as a stranger in another country. So he really talks about the difficulties of being an unskilled, irregular migrant in Norway. And then Badia, who's also returned from Norway, but she works as a university lecturer in Morocco at the moment, and she was doing a PhD in Norway. When she talked to fellow Moroccans about Norway when she was still there, she says, I try to paint an image of a country that's well developed so anyone thinking of migrating there should have high skills and competences. And I think this is something that comes up quite a lot in the data as well. So now I want to look briefly at which types of migration I feel fit very easily in the migration systems thinking and which don't to the way I analyze it. First of all, the Moroccans as the oldest and most established groups of these three, even though they are mid-sized. And this is very typical, like I discussed earlier, the labor migration in the 1960s, followed by family reunification. And there is also a smaller group of students, professionals, but they have separate networks. At the same time, they benefit from many of the same feedback mechanisms of finding ways into Norway. But what I want to argue is that it's really important to look at it in the larger European context, rather than just focusing on migration streams from Morocco to Norway, because many of the Moroccans didn't directly come to Norway. They tried to find work in Germany, didn't manage, then moved on and ended up in Norway, for example. So again, two quotes to illustrate some of the character of this type of migration. Amina, moving for marriage migration with a Norwegian Moroccan in 1986. She says, I did not have any information about Norway, except that the country belongs to Europe. Thus, life would be better there. I had never heard anything special about Norway, but I wanted to come because I wanted a better future for myself, and Europe was the symbol of a better life. I think that's very much typical for a lot of the migration to Norway, that it's not like the UK or Portugal in the case of Brazilians, that people deliberately, this is a country they want to go to. It's part of Europe, that'll do, in a way. But then for some, it is actually a deliberate choice, but more as a kind of not choosing something else. So a number of the Moroccans, for example, also a number of the Brazilians say, I didn't want to go to France, I didn't want to go to Portugal, because there were already too many Moroccans, there were already too many Brazilians there. So you can read the quote for yourself, but basically Sami Noureddin talks about how he knew the French-Moroccan culture, and that's not what he wanted, in a way. Again, I think this quote you could read for yourself, but I can give you a little bit of the context. Najib's family is spread. He himself was interviewed in Morocco, but his father started off the migration of about 15 family members. And his father moved to the Netherlands in 1960. Then a brother of his father, so his uncle, moved in 1970, first to France, then to the Netherlands, and then he ended up in Norway. And between them, they enabled people to come to the Netherlands as well as Norway throughout the years. A couple of brothers, of Najib's brothers, are now in Norway. A couple are in in the Netherlands, and it's very much this kind of, okay, because these fast people were the pioneers, they then enabled the movement of others whose movement is not necessarily, so the conditions of migration changed. So it's independent of these original conditions. People manage to come because there's all these systems in place that make it possible, and there's the migration culture and all kinds of institutions as well. He talks about before it was this bukta, and now you have cafes, you have the internet to make it possible. But then there's also the migration system with a question mark. How relevant is this thinking in terms of looking at high-skilled professionals and students, for example? And there we really came across a lot of trouble trying to ask them questions about the fast pioneers, whether they were assisting others, because they moved for academic or professional opportunities, and like I said, there's very few connections with the migration of others. And there are actually clear attractions to Norway. Better pay, higher standard of living, interesting job opportunities, scholarships for students. But then it's still often described as a random event. And it includes a range of high-skilled professionals. I think I'm doing the same as Eva. Working for Norwegian companies in Brazil, particularly oil industry, but not only, and also headhunted or applying for doctoral positions, for example. And this is mainly Ukrainians and Brazilians. So to give you some quotes from that group, Sabrina, who came as a Brazilian professional in Norway, says, "The Brazilian people I know do not bring others to Norway because no one wants to come here. It's a financial thing. The ones who bring people are the ones who have friends and family in need in Brazil. If your family does not need your help, you do not bring people to Norway. No one with a good standard of life in Brazil wants to move to another country." And this is something that is mentioned quite a lot. I think this is a typical quote here, but it doesn't stand alone. And then also Taras, who moved with his wife, who went for studies to Norway, the University of Oslo, he says, "We made the decision to move to Norway together, based on which university she wanted to study and which country would give us the best offer." I think that's also very typical, that it's about, okay, we have different options, we pick the country that is most advantageous for us. And then Norway often does come up high with a high quality of living and high salary offers. So in conclusion, I do want to point out 3 critiques to current migration system thinking. I think first of all, this whole idea of emergent, it can't be explored through pioneers only. First of all, because in a country like Norway with such small populations, it's really difficult. There is no collective memory. So I find that, for example, the stories about pioneers in Morocco, there are a lot more interesting stories from the returnees and the family members in Morocco than we were able to get in Oslo, interestingly. And also amongst Brazilians and Ukrainians, there isn't this kind of collective, this myth about, okay, these were the first people who arrived, which is very different in the case of the UK, Brazilians and Portugal, where there are these kind of collective stories. We have individual stories, so it just depends on who could remember, who was connected to those first people, and that's often very few. And another reason why this is problematic is that we clearly found in Themis that there is a difference between waves and there's a difference between cohorts that makes this idea of one like pioneer group very problematic. So over time, I think the example was mentioned of the Ukrainians. The ones straight after the Second World War have nothing to do with the movement post-independence. But also in terms of geography, if you look at Brazil, for example, it's quite problematic to think about movement from Brazil to Norway because it's such a huge country with huge differences. And the people who move from the north really do not interact that much with the people who moved from Rio or Sao Paulo. Secondly, I think these feedback explorations, which I think are very interesting, but it's very often explored from these unidirectional flows of migrants, so from Morocco to Norway. And I think it's very important to explore also the impact of flows in the other direction. So what happened with Norwegians moving to Brazil, and how does that actually impact? What kind of feedback mechanisms start from there? And that's not something that necessarily is not possible within migration system thinking. I just feel it's not done. And then thirdly, very importantly as well, migrants are very differently positioned depending on the legal systems, facilitating or constraining their movements. And that impacts the relevance of the migration system concept. So the waves where we have to really look at differences in legal frameworks. I think the DMIC project of IMI is trying to map out, okay, what were the legal changes over time in, I think, all countries around the world. I'm not really sure. But I think that's really important because you can only analyze the reality of those who came in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, depending on what the legal frameworks were that they had to deal with. And then also, like I argue, the education, professional background, age and gender, ethnicity, all of that is very crucial in where they are positioned, where migrants are positioned. So, migration systems or beyond. I think Thomas yesterday was saying migration research. I found that a very important point. Migration research is part of how migration is framed. It's so much it's so close also to policy. So what migration is considered worthy of study or not, I think is very important in how migration then is framed. So our own responsibility and what kind of questions do we ask, which types of migrants, I think is really important. And that's especially why I think it's important to be critical of migration system theory, because it easily makes power and politics invisible. So what it also does is make invisible many of the inequalities that are created by the legal system. But then this is where I was hoping to come with a kind of bang, and this is the way to go. But I have a lot of questions. So is the solution to find better ways of bringing agency in migration systems theorizing, as Oliver proposes? Is it best to keep the two separate, like Thomas was proposing, and then coming with a meso concept that tries to link the two? Maybe the way Eva was arguing today, to invest more in theoretical innovations in thinking about agency. Or maybe what Agnieszka is working on a lot is to study more systematically the structural conditions. So, for example, the legal systems and how migrants then strategize, like your paper on semi-legality and also the presentation tomorrow. Or to replace migration systems with systemic migration might be a way forward. And with that, I leave you to reflect. Thank you.